Tonight we're going to do a curried pumpkin dal. I like Indian food. Our family went to India earlier this year, and the food was definitely not a problem for me. And it's fall, so what better time than to talk about pumpkins, especially for those of you who have them growing in your gardens this year. So for this particular recipe, you're going to make a paste. It's a seasoning paste, and I will tell you that this particular seasoning paste, although we're using it in a curried pumpkin dal, you can use this seasoning paste in any Indian recipe, any kind of Indian curry recipe, whether you were wanting to do, say, curried lentils or maybe curried potatoes, any kind of curry recipe. The paste that we're gonna make right now, you can use for any of that. So what you'll do is you'll just take a blender and we're gonna throw in our paste ingredients. It calls for 1 medium onion. Now, I happen to believe that if a little onion is good, a lot of onion is better. So I tend to go a little heavy on the onion. And you're not chopping the onion, to go in to be bite-sized, because it's going to get whizzed up in your blender. I'm just chopping it to make it a little bit easier on the blender. You're going to use 1/3 cup of grated coconut. You can also use coconut milk if you prefer coconut milk. I didn't have any coconut milk, so I'm just going to use the grated coconut. Now this is unsweetened coconut. This is just pure grated coconut with no sweetener in it. We're going to use 3 cloves of garlic. Now I don't know if you can see that. I've said before that when I do my garlic, I buy garlic in very large quantities, and I put it in a food processor. I mince it down, and then I spread it into ice cube trays. And this is one of my cubes of garlic. And I throw those ice cube trays in the freezer so that when I need garlic, I just get out a cube or a half a cube and I put it in whatever dish. The flavor is far superior doing it that way than buying those jars of watery garlic in the grocery store that have no flavor and no taste whatsoever. So that's a cheat on that. Now, the recipe does call for some sort of a chili. I sometimes will use chili and I usually don't. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I usually use it for the flavor. So when I use chili, I typically don't put it in the blender. I put the whole chili in the dish while I'm cooking it, all right? That way I'm getting the flavor of the chili without necessarily getting the heat of the chili. But for those of you who like the heat, what you do, you want to wash your chili, cut off the ends, and slice it right down the middle. Inside this chili, there are little seeds, and you want to get rid of them because they will not set well with your tummy, probably. They can be very hot and spicy. And then after you do this, after you get the seeds and that little white strip out of there, you can then throw it in your blender. Now, after you do that, you want to wash your hands, because if you were to touch your eyes with your hands or touch your nose with your hands, it'd make you cry. It's very spicy, right? But again, I very rarely do that. I find that if I eat that sort of thing, it upsets my tummy. But I will, from time to time, use a whole chili in the cooking process. That way I'm just getting that flavor without that heat. All right, it calls for gram masala, 2 teaspoons. One teaspoon of cumin. One teaspoon of salt. The recipe calls for 1/4 of a teaspoon of turmeric, But just like the onion and the garlic, if a little bit is good, a lot is better. I tend to go pretty heavy on my turmeric. Turmeric is very good for you. It's anti-inflammatory. So I actually put in a whole teaspoon of turmeric. I brought this particular turmeric home from India, and I have to say I really like it. It has a slightly more pungent flavor than the turmeric that I get here in the States, and so I've enjoyed this little package. It's almost gone. And it calls for coriander. Now you find coriander in most of your Indian dishes. 1/4 of a teaspoon. And honestly, I use kind of a heaping 1/4 of a teaspoon. Now I will tell you, I have this in my pantry because I inherited it from a friend who is moving. But actually, I grow my own coriander. It's really super easy to grow. When you have your cilantro growing in your garden, just allow some of it to grow to seed, because the cilantro seeds, that's coriander. You can use the whole seeds, or you can grind it and make powder out of it. So this is store-bought, but don't feel like you have to rely on store-bought seasonings, because you don't. A lot of them are super easy to grow, even if you don't have garden. Even if you just have a pot on the back of your porch or in a window, you can allow that to go to seed. So we've got our onion, our coconut, garlic, the cumin and salt and turmeric, the coriander, and then we're going to take, the recipe calls for 2 cups of either water or stock. I usually make my own stock, but I did not have any on hand. So I bought some vegetable stock, and of that 2 cups of stock, I'm going to take 2 tablespoons of that and add it to this paste. 1, 2. Now hold your ears for a minute, because I'm going to whiz it down. It won't take very long. Let me grab the plunger. There you go. It's whizzed down. Now this is awesome. And you can adjust these flavorings however you like. If there's an Indian flavor that you like more than another, feel free to adjust it. But this basic paste that you just created, you can use for anything. Now I'm going to take a couple of teaspoons of my broth here in my pan, because I'm using that instead of oil. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just warm that up real quick in my pan, and then I'm going to pour this paste into the pan. I'm going to cook that for about 5 minutes or so. Now in India, they will often put the dry seasonings in the pan, just dry, and warm them up, and then they will crush them. We kind of did it the easy cheat way by just putting everything in the blender, and now we're gonna cook it down a little bit that way. So while that's cooking, I'm gathering my other ingredients, which is 2 cups of diced tomatoes. If I have tomatoes from the garden, I'll just chop them up and use that. If I don't, then I will use the canned. Calls for fresh pumpkin. Now, although it calls for fresh pumpkin, you don't have to use pumpkin. You can use acorn squash, butternut squash, any of your squashes, feel free to use them. For those of you who've never used a pumpkin, and I hadn't until a few years ago, to tell you the truth, I always bought it. You just wash it, cut it in half. I use the other half of this for what I'll show you later. Cut it in half, and then you want to take the seeds out. Just take a spoon and take those seeds right out, and the stringy stuff. Now these seeds, you can actually save them and roast them a little bit in your oven and eat them. My daughter likes to do that. She loves it whenever I have pumpkin. I did not plant pumpkin this year, we normally do. And I'll put them in the dehydrator, or sometimes I'll put them in the oven and just lightly roast them. And she loves to eat them kind of like you do sunflower seeds. So that's kind of fun. And then you just chop it. And I use a peeler to peel it. Now, to tell you the truth, honestly, I often don't do this. I will just cut the pumpkin or any of the squashes, whether it's acorn squash or butternut squash, pumpkin, whatever it is, Hubbard squash, cut it in half, de-seed it, put it upside down in a baking dish with a little bit of water, and then I throw it in the oven and I let it bake because it's just faster that way. But if you take the time to actually peel it and then chop it, it's going to hold its texture better in your dish than it does when you bake it. When you bake it, it gets kind of a little soft and a little mushy. But for this particular recipe, I don't want it soft and mushy. I want it to have its form. And so you just chop it. Easy peasy. So we've got our pumpkin here. It calls for black-eyed peas. Now I cooked these from dried peas. You can use canned. If you use canned peas, then it's best to pour that liquid off and rinse those peas so that you're getting as much of the sodium out as possible. If you're using dried peas, just wash them, soak them in water overnight. And what I mean by soaking is put a lot of water in your pan, a good amount of water on top of the peas, let them soak overnight, and they'll plump right up. Now the trick is, you want to pour that water off in the morning, because if you don't pour that water off, if you cook the dried peas in the water that you soaked them in, you're probably going to have a problem with gas. We call it aromatosis in my family. And so if you pour that water off, rinse it, and then put fresh water on, they'll cook right down. They do not take long to cook at all. So these are just dried peas, cooked. There's nothing in them. There's no salt, no nothing. And then kale, and I am so unhappy because I left my kale at home. I was so excited to show you kale. I've never grown kale before, but I grew kale this year in my garden, and it's awesome. It's just growing like gangbusters, and I've got a couple of different varieties. And Dr. Howe actually taught me that kale is best after the first frost because then it gets sweet. And I thought, yeah, right, how is that possible? Well, don't you know? I tasted it before the first frost and it was good, but I allowed it to stay out until after that first frost, and man, was that ever delicious. And I wanted to show it off to you, and I didn't. So there, that's what I get for trying to show off. But anyway, fresh kale is really terrific. If you don't have fresh kale, you can definitely use frozen. You can also use spinach, fresh spinach or frozen spinach. Any kind of green, whatever you have, will be fine. And then at the very end, once our dish has actually fully cooked, we're going to throw in some mint. So our paste has been cooking here. I don't know if you can see that. It has a nice yellow color. We're going to throw in our pumpkin. You're going to imagine that that's 4 cups of pumpkin, because I'm not going to bore you by standing here and chopping pumpkin for you. We're going to pour in the rest of our 1 cup. And here comes our second cup. We're going to put in our tomatoes. And we're just going to let that cook for momentarily. It'll take probably about 10 minutes for that pumpkin to cook down and to get nice and soft. And then once it does, we're going to throw in our black-eyed peas. And our kale. You're just going to imagine that this is nice, green, wonderful kale. I would just chop it up and throw it in. Now I do de-rib my kale, those big, thick, sort of stemmy, chunky areas down at the bottom. I will take those off, but the rest of it I keep, and I will chop it. Although I will tell you, I have found with some kale that if you chop it, some kale can leave a bit of a bitter taste when you chop it, whereas if you tear it, it doesn't. I'm assuming that's a chemistry component that I haven't looked into much yet, but if I'm not using a lot of kale, just a little bit, like this is just 2 cups, I'll just tear it right up into my pan. And then you cook that down. So once the squash is soft, and once the peas are nice and soft, then your dish is pretty much ready. And I think we have a question.
We do. Someone is asking if we can use beans instead of black-eyed peas.
You can absolutely use beans. Chickpeas are amazing. I've used leftover pinto beans. I've used black beans. You can use any kind of bean. Chickpeas are particularly good though. We don't have a lot of purple hull peas up here, but purple hull peas are good in this dish. I have used those. So, I don't know if you can see that very well, but you'll cook that down. Your spinach or your kale you will add, and then this is what it's going to look like. Kinda. I made this earlier, right? So there you go. Now, when it's freshly cooked, the green is much greener. Some people might look at this and think, oh, that looks like throw up. It doesn't look quite so dead when it's fresh. It's actually really, really, really tasty. You can freeze this also. So if you make more than you use, feel free to throw it in the freezer. You can defrost it and warm it up. Now, I normally serve this either over rice, or because so much of the rice now has arsenic in it, I am using less rice than I have in the past. And what I use mostly now is actually cooked groats, which looks like rice, and I use it just like rice. So I would put this on the bottom of my plate or my bowl, dish this right over, and enjoy my meal. Now, if you're not familiar with groats, I brought some to show you. It's just a whole grain. It's the whole oat. It's the whole of what you're used to with oatmeal or Irish or steel cut oats. It's just the whole oat. It cooks like rice. It's about the same proportion of water to grain as rice. The kernel, once it's cooked, is a little bit more plump than rice, but it has wonderful nutrition, wonderful fiber for you, and our family really enjoys it. When I have leftover groats, then I can use it for breakfast in the morning, or I might use it to make some sort of patty. It's a great thing to have on board.